In the dusty town of Clearwater, Texas, where men settled debts with bullets and handshakes meant more than contracts, Jake Morrison thought he understood the price of everything. He knew what a good horse cost, what loyalty was worth, and how much blood it took to earn respect. But, when old Samuel Henley offered him the deed to his ranch and his daughter's hand in marriage as payment for a debt, Jake discovered there were some things that couldn't be bought, sold, or given away. What he didn't know was that the girl had plans of her own, and she was about to teach this hardened cowboy that the most valuable things in life aren't found in ledger books or spoken promises between men. Sometimes, the greatest reward comes disguised as the biggest challenge you never saw coming. The sun was dying behind the mountains when Jake Morrison rode into Clearwater, dust trailing behind his horse like a brown ghost. His leather chaps were stained with sweat and grime, testament to 3 weeks of hard riding through territories where decent men feared to tread. The silver spurs on his boots caught the last light of day as he dismounted outside the Broken Wheel Saloon, their gentle chiming the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings that lined Main Street. Jake had come to collect a debt, though he suspected the man who owed it had little left to give. Samuel Henley had borrowed $2,000 6 months ago to keep his failing ranch afloat, using his property as collateral. The drought had been merciless that summer, and word traveled fast in cattle country about men who couldn't make their payments. Most creditors would have taken the land and walked away, but Jake Morrison wasn't most men. He believed in giving folks a chance to make things right, which was why he was here in person instead of sending lawyers with foreclosure papers. The saloon doors swung open as Jake approached, and he found himself face to face with a mountain of a man wearing a sheriff's badge. Tom Bradley had held law in Clearwater for 15 years, and his weathered face bore the scars of keeping peace in a town that attracted more than its share of trouble. "Jake Morrison," Bradley said, extending a meaty hand. "Heard you might be coming through. Samuel's been expecting you." "Sheriff Bradley." Jake shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip that spoke of years handling difficult situations. "I'm hoping we can settle this without any unpleasantness." Bradley nodded slowly, his gray eyes studying Jake's face. "Sam's a good man who's had a run of bad luck. Lost most of his herd to disease, then the drought took what the sickness didn't. Wife died 2 winters back, and he's been raising his daughter alone. That girl's been keeping the ranch books and managing what little business they have left." "I heard about his troubles," Jake replied, adjusting his hat against the evening breeze. "That's why I'm here to talk instead of just taking what's mine by law." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "You're known as a fair man, Morrison. Hope that reputation holds true tonight." He gestured toward the end of town where a collection of buildings sat beneath a grove of cottonwood trees. "Sam's place is about a mile down the main road. Can't miss it. There's a wooden sign with Circle H Ranch burned into it, though the letters are pretty faded now." Jake tipped his hat and remounted his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle who had carried him through more adventures than he cared to count. The ride to the Henley Ranch gave him time to think about what he'd say to Samuel. The man had borrowed money in good faith, but circumstances beyond his control had made repayment impossible. Jake had seen it happen dozens of times across the territory, decent families destroyed by forces they couldn't fight or predict. The Circle H ranch house sat in a clearing surrounded by oak trees, their branches creating dark shadows in the fading light. It was a modest 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide front porch that spoke of better times when the family might have sat outside in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Now, several loose boards on the porch sagged, and the paint was peeling from the window frames. A lamp glowed in the front window as Jake approached, and he could see movement inside. He tied Belle to a hitching post near the front steps, noting that the post was solid and well-maintained despite the general state of disrepair around the property. Someone was still taking care of the important details, even if they couldn't afford to fix everything. Before Jake could knock, the front door opened. Samuel Henley stood in the doorway, and Jake was struck by how much the man had aged since their last meeting. Samuel's brown hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines etched his face like a map of worry and loss. But his eyes remained clear and honest, and he straightened his shoulders as he recognized his visitor. "Jake Morrison," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've been expecting you. Please, come inside." The interior of the house was clean and organized, though Jake noticed signs of financial struggle everywhere he looked. The furniture was old but well cared for, and the walls held family photographs that spoke of happier times. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Coffee's fresh," Samuel offered, gesturing toward a pot sitting on a small table near the fireplace. "Mary always said a man should offer hospitality even in difficult times." Jake accepted the cup gratefully, appreciating the warmth and the rich, dark brew. "I'm sorry for your loss, Sam. Mary was a good woman." Samuel's expression softened at the mention of his late wife. "She was the heart of this place. After she passed, it felt like everything started falling apart. The ranch, my spirit, everything except." He paused, looking toward a doorway that led to what Jake assumed was the kitchen. "Everything except Emma." As if summoned by her father's words, a young woman appeared in the doorway. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he got his first look at Emma Henley. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple blue dress that had been mended in several places, but she carried herself with a dignity that made the worn fabric seem unimportant. "Emma, this is Jake Morrison," Samuel said. "Jake, my daughter Emma." Emma studied Jake for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Morrison, I've heard about you from the folks in town. They say you're a fair man, but also that you always collect what you're owed." There was no hostility in her voice, just a directness that Jake found refreshing. Most women he encountered in business situations either deferred to the men present or tried to manipulate the conversation through charm. Emma Henley seemed to be doing neither. "I try to be fair," Jake replied. "And I do expect people to honor their commitments when possible." Emma nodded and took a seat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Then, you should know that we've calculated exactly how much we owe you, including interest, and we understand that we cannot pay it." Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Emma handles our books now. She's got a head for numbers that I never possessed. The total debt is $2,347, Emma continued, her voice matter-of-fact. "We have $68 in cash, 11 head of cattle that might bring $300 at market, and this property which was assessed at $1,800 before the drought." Jake was impressed by her precise knowledge of their financial situation, but also saddened by the stark reality of their circumstances. "That leaves you considerably short." "It does," Samuel admitted. "Which is why I asked you to come here instead of just sending legal papers. I have a proposition." Jake leaned forward, curious about what Samuel might offer. In his experience, desperate men sometimes came up with creative solutions, though they weren't always practical or legal. "The Circle H Ranch has been in my family for 3 generations," Samuel began. "My grandfather built this house with his own hands, and my father expanded the operation until we had one of the finest herds in the county. Even now, with proper management and a little good fortune, this could be a profitable operation again." "I understand your family's connection to this place," Jake said carefully. "But that doesn't change the mathematics of your situation." Samuel took a deep breath before continuing. "What I'm proposing is that you take ownership of the ranch to settle the debt. But, instead of just taking the property and leaving us homeless, I'm offering something additional." He paused, glancing at his daughter. "I'm offering Emma's hand in marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Jake felt his heartbeat quicken as he processed what Samuel had just suggested. He looked at Emma, expecting to see shock or anger on her face, but her expression remained composed. "You're offering your daughter as part of a business transaction?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm offering you a partnership," Samuel corrected. "Emma knows this ranch better than anyone. She's kept it running for the past 2 years while I dealt with Mary's illness and death. She understands the land, the cattle, the business side of the operation. A man could do worse than marry a woman who brings both beauty and brains to a marriage." Jake set down his coffee cup and studied Emma's face. "And what does Miss Henley think about being offered as collateral?" Emma met his gaze directly. I think my father is a desperate man who's trying to solve multiple problems with one solution. Her voice carried no bitterness, just resignation. I also think that marriage, even one arranged for business purposes, might be preferable to being homeless and destitute. That's a rather practical view of marriage, Jake observed. I'm a practical woman, Mr. Morrison. I've had to be. Emma stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. I loved my mother dearly, but watching her waste away from consumption taught me that life doesn't always give us the luxury of romantic ideals. Sometimes we have to make the best choices available to us, not the perfect choices we might prefer. Jake found himself studying the curve of her neck as she stood by the fire, and he realized that Samuel's offer wasn't entirely without appeal. Emma Henley was undeniably beautiful, but, more importantly, she possessed an intelligence and strength of character that he found attractive. Still, the idea of marriage as a business arrangement troubled him. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Jake said finally. Marriage is a serious commitment, not just a way to settle debts. Samuel leaned forward in his chair. I'm not suggesting you decide tonight. Take some time to consider the proposition. Stay here for a few days, get to know Emma, see the ranch operation. If you decide this arrangement could work, we'll have a proper wedding and you'll gain not just the land but a partner who can help you make it profitable again. And if I decide it won't work? Then, you take the deed to the property and we'll make other arrangements for ourselves, Samuel replied. But I believe you'll find that Emma is a remarkable young woman who would make any man a good wife. Emma turned from the fireplace, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I should point out that I haven't agreed to marry you, Mr. Morrison. My father can offer my hand, but I'm the one who would have to say the vows. Jake couldn't help but smile at her directness. Fair enough, Miss Henley. What would it take to earn your agreement? Respect, she said immediately. I won't be treated like property that changes hands between men. If we were to marry, it would need to be a true partnership, not just a legal arrangement that gives you ownership of me along with the ranch. What else? Emma considered the question carefully. Time. I'd need time to get to know you before making such a decision. And honesty. I'd need to know exactly what kind of man you are and what kind of life you could offer. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the pastures where Henley cattle once grazed in great numbers. He could see the potential in this place, could imagine what it might become with proper investment and management. But, more than that, he found himself intrigued by Emma Henley and her unusual combination of beauty, intelligence, and practical strength. I'll need a few days to think about this, he said finally. And, Miss Henley is right about needing time to become acquainted. There's a room upstairs that you're welcome to use, Samuel offered. It was my son's room before he left for California. Jake turned back to face them. You have a son? Had, Samuel corrected sadly. David died in a mining accident 3 years ago. He was 25, full of dreams about striking it rich in the gold fields. The loss of a child explained another layer of Samuel's desperation. Jake realized that Emma was now his only surviving family, which made the offer of her hand in marriage even more significant. Samuel wasn't just trying to save his ranch, he was trying to ensure his daughter's future security. I'm sorry for your loss, Jake said sincerely. I'll accept your offer of hospitality for a few days while I consider your proposition. As Samuel showed him upstairs to the guest room, Jake found his mind racing with thoughts about the unusual situation he'd encountered. He'd come to Clearwater expecting to foreclose on a failed ranch, but instead found himself considering marriage to a woman he'd just met. The rational part of his mind warned him that business and romance should never be mixed, but another part was already wondering what it would be like to wake up each morning in this house, with Emma Henley as his wife. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a single window that looked out over the ranch's main pasture. As Jake prepared for bed, he could hear quiet conversation from downstairs, though he couldn't make out the words. He suspected that father and daughter were discussing the evening's conversation and his potential response to Samuel's offer. Jake Morrison had made his fortune by being careful, calculating risks before making decisions, and never letting emotion cloud his business judgment. But, as he lay in the narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, he realized that Emma Henley had already begun to affect his usually logical thought processes. The question now was whether that was a good thing or a dangerous complication that could cost him more than just money. Outside his window, an owl called from somewhere in the cottonwood trees, and Jake found himself thinking that some decisions couldn't be reduced to simple mathematics. Sometimes, a man had to trust his instincts and hope for the best, even when the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. Dawn came early to the Circle H ranch, announced by the crow of a rooster and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distant pasture. Jake Morrison woke to unfamiliar sounds and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, finding Emma already at work preparing breakfast while her father sat at the kitchen table reviewing a stack of papers. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Emma said without turning from the stove where bacon sizzled in a cast-iron skillet. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Jake replied honestly. The bed had been comfortable, and, despite the unusual circumstances that brought him here, he'd found the ranch's peaceful atmosphere conducive to rest. "Please, call me Jake." Emma glanced over her shoulder, her green eyes catching the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "Very well, Jake. And you may call me Emma, provided you understand that familiarity doesn't imply acceptance of my father's proposition." Jake couldn't help but smile at her directness. Most women he knew would have spent the morning fluttering around awkwardly after such a conversation, but Emma seemed determined to address their unusual situation head-on. "Understood completely," Jake said, taking his seat across from Samuel at the table. "What are you reading there, Sam?" Samuel looked up from his papers, his expression troubled. "Bills, mostly. The veterinarian who treated our cattle during the disease outbreak, the feed supplier who extended us credit through the drought, the banknote for equipment I bought before everything went wrong." He gestured helplessly at the stack. "Even if you decided to accept my offer and take over the ranch, these debts would still need addressing." Jake studied the papers as Samuel spread them across the table. The amounts were substantial, though not insurmountable for a man with Jake's resources. But they represented another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. "How much in total?" Jake asked. "Nearly $800, Emma answered before her father could respond. She set plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits on the table before joining them. "I've been negotiating payment schedules with most of our creditors, but their patience is wearing thin." Jake sampled the breakfast, surprised by how good everything tasted. "This is excellent, Emma. You're a fine cook." "Thank you. Mother taught me when I was young, and I've had plenty of practice since she became ill." Emma's voice carried a hint of sadness, but she quickly turned the conversation back to business. "If you're serious about considering Father's proposition, you should understand exactly what you'd be taking on." Over the next hour, Emma walked Jake through the ranch's financial situation with a thoroughness that would have impressed any banker. She showed him ledger books filled with her neat handwriting, detailed records of cattle sales, feed purchases, and operational expenses dating back 3 years. Her knowledge of every aspect of the ranch's business was remarkable. "You've essentially been running this operation yourself," Jake observed as Emma explained a complex deal she'd negotiated to sell cattle to a buyer in Abilene. "Someone had to," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "After Mother died and David left for California, Father was too grief-stricken to focus on business matters. By the time he recovered emotionally, we were already in financial trouble." Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I let my family down when they needed me most." Emma reached over and squeezed her father's hand. "You did your best under impossible circumstances. No one blames you for grieving." The gesture revealed a tenderness in Emma that balanced her businesslike demeanor, and Jake found himself increasingly intrigued by her complex personality. She was clearly devoted to her father despite his failures, yet practical enough to acknowledge their dire situation. "I'd like to see the ranch operation," Jake said. "If you have time to show me around." Emma nodded and stood to clear the breakfast dishes. "Father has business in town this morning, but I can give you a complete tour. Fair warning though, what you'll see isn't encouraging." An hour later, Jake found himself walking beside Emma through pastures that should have been filled with cattle. The grass was brown and sparse, testament to the drought that had devastated the region. Wooden fence posts leaned at odd angles, and several sections of fencing had gaps where repairs were needed. "We had nearly 300 head before the troubles began," Emma explained as they walked. "Disease took about 60 cattle, and we had to sell most of the rest at poor prices to pay for medical treatment and basic expenses." "What kind of disease?" "Texas fever," the veterinarian called it. "Spread by ticks, mostly affects cattle that haven't been exposed before. Our herd had no immunity." Emma's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd watched helplessly as circumstances beyond her control destroyed years of work. They continued walking, and Jake began to see signs of Emma's efforts to maintain what remained of the operation. Despite the general state of disrepair, the water troughs were clean and functional, the barn was organized and swept, and the few remaining cattle looked healthy and well cared for. "You've been working alone?" Jake asked, noting the extensive labor that would be required to maintain even this reduced operation. "Mostly. We kept one hired hand, Miguel Santos, but we can only afford to pay him sporadically. He stays because his family has worked for ours for 20 years, but I know it's been difficult for him." As if summoned by their conversation, a compact, weathered man approached from the direction of the barn. Miguel Santos had kind eyes and work-roughened hands that spoke of decades spent caring for cattle and horses. "Buenos dias, Señorita Emma," Miguel said, touching his hat brim respectfully before turning to Jake. "You must be Señor Morrison." "I am. Pleased to meet you, Miguel." Miguel's handshake was firm, and Jake noticed the man's careful assessment as they were introduced. Clearly, Miguel was protective of the Henley family and suspicious of any stranger who might threaten their welfare. "Miguel knows more about cattle than anyone in 3 counties, Emma said. "If you decide to rebuild this operation, you'd be wise to listen to his advice. The land is good," Miguel added, gesturing toward the pastures around them. "With rain and proper management, this could support 200 head again, maybe more." Jake nodded, appreciating the man's straightforward assessment. "What would it take to get back to that level?" "Money, mostly," Miguel replied with characteristic directness. "New cattle, fence repairs, equipment maintenance. And time. Maybe 2 years to rebuild properly." As they walked back toward the house, Jake found himself calculating the investment that would be required. The numbers were substantial but not unreasonable for someone with his resources. More importantly, he was beginning to see the potential that had once made the Circle H a successful operation. "The house needs work too," Emma said as they approached the front porch. "The roof leaks in 2 places, and the well pump should be replaced before winter." Jake was struck by Emma's honesty about the property's deficiencies. Most people trying to make a sale would have emphasized the positives and downplayed the problems, but Emma seemed determined to ensure he understood exactly what he'd be taking on. "You're not making this sound very appealing," Jake observed with amusement. Emma stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "I won't trick you into a bad decision, even if that decision might benefit my family. If you're going to consider my father's proposition, you should do it with full knowledge of what you'd be getting." The afternoon was spent reviewing more financial records and discussing the practical aspects of ranch management. Emma's knowledge impressed Jake repeatedly as she explained everything from seasonal cattle breeding cycles to the complexities of dealing with different buyers in various markets. As evening approached, Samuel returned from town with troubling news. "The bank president wants to meet with us next week," he announced as he joined Jake and Emma in the sitting room. "Our note for the equipment loan is 3 months behind, and they're talking about calling it in." Emma's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "How much time do they give us?" 2 weeks to bring the account current or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Samuel slumped into his chair, looking every one of his 55 years. "That's another $1,200 we don't have." Jake absorbed this new information, realizing that the Henley family's situation was even more desperate than he'd initially understood. Even if they could resolve the debt to him, they'd still face losing everything to the bank unless additional funds could be found quickly. "There's something else," Samuel continued reluctantly.
Word has gotten around town about your visit. People are talking. What kind of talk? Emma asked. Speculation about whether you're here to foreclose or whether some other arrangement might be possible. Samuel's voice carried embarrassment.
I may have mentioned my proposition to Sheriff Bradley, and you know how news travels in a small town.
Emma stood abruptly and walked to the window, her posture tense.
So now everyone in Clearwater knows that my father is trying to marry me off to settle his debts.
It's not like that, Samuel protested.
I explained that it would be a business partnership, a marriage that could benefit everyone involved.
A marriage of convenience, Emma said without turning around. How romantic. Jake found himself moved by the pain in Emma's voice.
Despite her practical attitude toward their situation, she was still a young woman who had probably once dreamed of marrying for love rather than financial necessity.
Emma, Jake said gently. May I speak with you privately?
She turned from the window, her expression guarded.
Of course.
Samuel excused himself, claiming he needed to check on something in the barn, leaving Jake and Emma alone in the sitting room. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, and shadows danced across the walls as evening settled over the ranch.
I can see that this situation is painful for you, Jake began carefully. And I want you to know that whatever decision I make, it won't be based on pity or desperation.
Emma returned to her chair, her hands folded in her lap.
Then, what would it be based on? Jake considered the question seriously before answering. Mutual benefit and genuine respect.
I've been around enough to know that marriages built on nothing but business arrangements rarely work well for anyone involved. But I've also learned that sometimes the best partnerships begin with practical considerations and grow into something deeper over time.
You're suggesting we might eventually come to care for each other?
I'm suggesting it's possible, if we're both honest about our expectations and committed to making the arrangement work.
Jake leaned forward in his chair.
Emma, you're clearly an intelligent, capable woman who could run this ranch as well as anyone.
You're also kind, honest, and beautiful.
A man could do much worse than marry someone with those qualities.
Emma studied his face intently. And what would I gain from such an arrangement, besides financial security?
A partner who respects your abilities and would rely on your judgment in managing our shared interests. Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. And, perhaps, eventually, the chance to build something meaningful together. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in thought about the unusual situation that had brought them together.
Outside, night sounds began as the ranch settled into darkness.
If I were to consider this, Emma said finally, I would need certain assurances.
What kind of assurances?
That I would maintain some independence, that my opinions would matter in decisions about the ranch, and that you wouldn't expect immediate intimacy in our marriage.
Emma's cheeks colored slightly at the last point, but her voice remained steady. Jake nodded.
Those seem like reasonable expectations.
What else?
I would want a proper courtship period, even if brief, so we could become better acquainted before making final commitments.
Emma met his eyes directly.
And I would need to know that you're not just agreeing to this out of pity for our circumstances.
What would convince you that my motivations are genuine? Emma considered the question. Time, I suppose.
And your willingness to be honest about your own expectations and concerns. Jake found himself appreciating Emma's forthright approach to their unusual situation. She wasn't allowing romantic fantasies to cloud her judgment, but neither was she approaching marriage as a purely business transaction. She seemed to be looking for a middle ground that could protect both their interests while leaving room for genuine affection to develop. I have a confession to make, Jake said. When I rode out here yesterday, I expected to spend an hour settling a debt and then, right away.
I never imagined I'd be considering marriage to someone I'd just met. And, now I find myself thinking that your father's proposition might not be as crazy as it initially seemed. Jake smiled slightly. You're not at all what I expected, Emma Henley. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. Someone more helpless, perhaps. Someone who would need rescuing rather than someone who could be a true partner. Jake paused. I've been a bachelor for 32 years because I never found a woman who seemed like an equal partner rather than just a pretty decoration. Emma's expression softened slightly. You've never been married? Never even been close. I've been too focused on building my business to spend much time thinking about family life. Jake gestured around the comfortable sitting room.
But, being here, seeing what you've accomplished under difficult circumstances, makes me think I may have been missing something important. Before Emma could respond, Samuel returned from his trip to the barn, his expression troubled. We may have another problem, he announced. Miguel tells me that cattle have been disappearing from the north pasture.
Rustlers? Jake asked. Possibly.
Or they might just be wandering off through broken fence sections.
Either way, we can't afford to lose any more cattle. Samuel sat down heavily. It feels like everything that can go wrong is going wrong all at once. Emma stood and moved toward the kitchen.
I'll make coffee and we can discuss what to do about the cattle.
Tomorrow we should ride out and check the fence lines.
As Emma busied herself in the kitchen, Jake found himself thinking about the accumulating challenges facing the Henley family. Financial problems, missing cattle, pressure from creditors, and, now the additional complication of gossip spreading through town about their unusual situation. Any one of these issues would be manageable, but, together they created a crisis that required immediate attention. But, instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of their circumstances, Jake found himself energized by the challenge. Emma Henley was clearly a woman who faced problems head-on rather than running from them, and her father, despite his recent struggles, was fundamentally a decent man trying to do right by his family. As Emma returned with coffee and the three of them began discussing plans for addressing the missing cattle, Jake realized that his decision was already made. He wasn't sure yet whether he would actually marry Emma Henley, but he was definitely going to help the family save their ranch. The question now was whether Emma would be willing to accept his help, and if so, on what terms. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from practical matters like fence repairs and cattle management to more personal topics like family history and individual dreams for the future. By the time Jake retired to his room, he had a much clearer understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities that awaited him if he chose to become permanently involved with the Circle H Ranch and the remarkable woman who had been keeping it running despite impossible odds. The next morning brought gray clouds and the promise of rain, something the drought-stricken land desperately needed. Jake woke early and found Emma already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast and packing supplies for their planned inspection of the fence lines where cattle had gone missing. Good morning, Emma said, her greeting warmer than it had been the previous day. I've packed food and coffee for our ride. Father thinks the problems are in the north section, where the fence runs along Wilson Creek. Jake accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, noting that Emma had remembered he preferred it black. Small details like that suggested she paid attention to people around her, another quality he found appealing. How long since anyone rode that section? Jake asked as he sampled the eggs and bacon she'd prepared. Too long, Emma admitted. With just Miguel and myself trying to maintain the whole operation, we've had to focus on the areas closest to the house. The north pasture has been neglected for months. Samuel joined them at the table, looking more rested than he had the night before. I appreciate you helping with this, Jake. I know it's not technically your responsibility yet. We're neighbors, at minimum, Jake replied. And neighbors help each other with problems like missing cattle. An hour later, Jake and Emma rode north from the ranch house, following a wagon trail that wound through mesquite and oak trees toward the distant creek. Jake rode Belle while Emma was mounted on a spirited paint horse named Patch, who clearly responded well to her confident handling. You're an excellent rider, Jake observed as they navigated a particularly rough section of trail. I've been riding since I was 5, Emma replied. Mother used to say I spent more time on horseback than on foot during my childhood. The trail led them through gradually changing landscape, from the rolling pastures near the house to more rugged terrain dotted with rock outcroppings and thick stands of trees. As they rode, Emma pointed out landmarks and explained the history of different sections of the ranch. That's where Grandfather built his first cabin when he claimed this land, she said, indicating a clearing where stone foundations were still visible among the grass. He lived there for 3 years while he built the main house.
He chose his location well, Jake noted, admiring the view across the valley from the elevated position.
Good water, natural protection, and plenty of room for expansion. They reached Wilson Creek after an hour's ride, finding a clear stream that bubbled over smooth stones between banks lined with cottonwood and willow trees. Even in the drought, the creek maintained a steady flow, though it was obviously much lower than normal. "This is where our north fence should start," Emma said, dismounting near a wooden post that leaned drunkenly to one side.
"As you can see, we have problems."
Jake surveyed the fence line and understood immediately why cattle had been wandering off. Several posts had fallen completely, and long sections of barbed wire lay tangled on the ground or hung loose between posts. What had once been a substantial barrier was now mostly useless.
"When was this fence last maintained properly?"
Jake asked as he examined a rotted post.
2 years ago, before father became ill and David left for California."
Emma's voice carried frustration as she assessed the damage. "I knew it needed work, but we couldn't afford materials or labor." They spent the next hour following the fence line, documenting the extent of the damage. Jake estimated that nearly half a mile of fencing would need complete reconstruction, while another quarter-mile required significant repairs. The work would be expensive and time-consuming, but absolutely necessary if they hoped to contain cattle effectively. "Look at this," Emma called from a section of fence about 50 yards ahead. She was kneeling beside what appeared to be fresh damage to the wire. Jake joined her and immediately understood her concern. The wire had been cut cleanly, not broken by weather or cattle pushing against it.
Someone had deliberately destroyed this section of fence.
"Rustlers," Jake said grimly. "They cut the fence to make it easier to drive cattle out of your pasture."
Emma stood and dusted off her hands, her expression angry. "So we're not just losing cattle to wandering, someone is stealing them." "How many head were missing from this section?" "Miguel counted 8 when he checked 3 days ago."
"All young steers, the most valuable animals we had left."
Emma's jaw tightened. "We can't afford to lose 8 cattle to thieves."
Jake studied the ground around the cut fence, noting the hoofprints and signs of recent activity. "They drove the cattle this way," he said, pointing toward tracks leading away from the creek.
"The trail heads northeast, toward the Brazos River country. Should we follow it?"
Jake considered the question carefully. Tracking stolen cattle could be dangerous, especially if they caught up with the thieves. But the Henley family couldn't afford to lose those animals, and letting rustlers operate without consequences would only encourage more theft. "We'll follow for a while, see where the trail leads," Jake decided. "But we'll be careful about it."
"Professional rustlers won't hesitate to shoot anyone who gets in their way." They remounted and began following the trail left by the stolen cattle.
The tracks were relatively fresh, probably no more than 2 or 3 days old, and led through increasingly rough country dotted with canyons and thick brush that would provide good cover for men trying to avoid detection.
"This is Comanche country," Emma said as they rode through a narrow valley between steep hills.
Or was, until the army moved them to the reservation. Local ranchers still find arrowheads and pottery fragments. Jake nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail while also watching for signs of anyone who might be watching them. The landscape was perfect for ambushes, with dozens of places where armed men could hide and control the approaches to any given area. After another hour of tracking, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a hidden valley where smoke rose from what appeared to be a temporary camp. Jake dismounted immediately and motioned for Emma to do the same. "Stay low," he whispered, pulling out a pair of field glasses from his saddlebags.
"Let's see what we're dealing with."
Through the glasses, Jake could see a makeshift corral constructed in the valley bottom, containing what looked like 15 or 20 head of cattle. Several men moved around a small fire, and Jake counted at least 4 horses tied nearby. A covered wagon sat beside the camp, probably used to transport supplies. "I can see our cattle," Jake reported quietly. 8 head with the Circle H brand, mixed in with other animals.
"Other brands?"
Jake adjusted the focus on his glasses, studying the cattle more carefully.
"At least 2 different brands I don't recognize."
"These boys have been busy."
Emma moved closer to get a better view of the valley. What do we do now? There are only 2 of us and, at least 4 of them. Jake lowered the glasses and considered their options. A direct confrontation would be dangerous and, probably unsuccessful. But, they couldn't just ride away and let the thieves escape with the stolen cattle. We ride back to town and get Sheriff Bradley, Jake decided. He'll want to organize a proper posse to deal with this. They retreated carefully from the ridge and began the ride back toward Clearwater, pushing their horses hard to cover ground quickly. Jake estimated it would take 2 hours to reach town and at least another 2 hours to return with the sheriff and a posse, assuming Bradley could gather enough men quickly. Will they still be there when we get back? Emma asked as they rode. Probably. They're holding cattle from multiple ranches, so they'll need time to alter the brands and organize transportation to wherever they plan to sell them. Jake urged Belle to a faster pace. Professional rustlers usually have a system for changing brands and moving stolen cattle to buyers who don't ask too many questions. The ride to Clearwater seemed to take forever, but they finally reached the sheriff's office in the late afternoon. Sheriff Bradley listened grimly as Jake described what they'd discovered, occasionally asking questions about the number of men and the layout of their camp. I know that valley, Bradley said when Jake finished his report. Good hiding place, but only one way in and out if you're driving cattle. We can trap them there if we move fast. Within an hour, Bradley had assembled a 6-man posse including himself, Jake, Miguel Santos, and 3 other local ranchers who had lost cattle recently. Emma wanted to join them, but Bradley firmly refused. This could turn into shooting, Miss Emma, the sheriff explained. I won't have a woman at risk when bullets start flying. Emma clearly wanted to argue, but she recognized the wisdom of Bradley's position. Just bring our cattle home, she said to Jake as the posse prepared to ride. The return trip to the hidden valley took place under cover of darkness, with Bradley leading the group through back trails that would allow them to approach the rustlers' camp without being detected. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to travel safely while also illuminating the valley where the stolen cattle were being held. Bradley positioned his men carefully around the rim of the valley, ensuring that the rustlers would have no escape route when confronted. Jake found himself crouched behind a boulder about 50 yards from the camp, with a clear view of the 4 men sitting around their fire. Sheriff's Department. Bradley's voice echoed through the valley as he stepped into view with his rifle ready. You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them. For a moment, the rustlers froze in surprise. Then, one of them dove for a rifle leaning against the wagon while the others scattered toward different positions around the camp. The peaceful evening erupted in gunfire as the posse members opened fire from their concealed positions. The fight was brief but intense, with bullets whining off rocks and thudding into the wooden wagon. Jake found himself trading shots with a bearded man who had taken cover behind the makeshift corral, forcing Jake to be careful about his aim to avoid hitting the stolen cattle. When the shooting stopped 5 minutes later, 3 of the rustlers lay dead and the 4th was wounded in the shoulder, moaning as Sheriff Bradley approached with handcuffs. None of the posse members had been injured, though several reported close calls. Check the cattle for brands, Bradley ordered as his men secured the wounded rustler. I want to know exactly which ranches these animals came from. The inspection revealed cattle from 5 different operations, including the 8 head stolen from the Circle H ranch. The rustlers had been operating in the area for several weeks, systematically stealing small numbers of cattle from various ranches in a pattern designed to avoid attracting attention. They were planning to drive the whole herd north to Kansas, where they have buyers waiting, the wounded rustler admitted as Bradley questioned him. We've been working this territory for months, taking just a few head at a time so nobody would notice. It was nearly dawn by the time the posse returned to Clearwater with the recovered cattle and their prisoner. Jake separated the Circle H animals from the rest and began the drive back to the ranch, where Emma and Samuel waited anxiously for news. I was so worried, Emma said as Jake rode into the ranch yard, driving the 8 recovered steers ahead of him. We heard gunshots in the distance and didn't know what had happened. Jake dismounted wearily, feeling the effects of a long day followed by an even longer night. Everyone in the posse is fine. The rustlers won't be stealing any more cattle.
Samuel helped drive the cattle into a secure pasture while Emma insisted that Jake come inside for coffee and food. As he sat at the familiar kitchen table, Jake realized that the events of the past day had changed something fundamental about his relationship with the Henley family. "You didn't have to risk yourself for our cattle," Emma said as she set a plate of food in front of him.
"Yes, I did," Jake replied simply. "We're partners now, whether we make it official or not. Partners look after each other's interests." Emma studied his face carefully. "Is that your way of saying you've decided to accept Father's proposition?" Jake met her gaze directly.
"I'm saying I've decided to invest in the Circle H Ranch and help rebuild it into a profitable operation. Whether that includes marriage depends on what you decide, not what your father offers." For the first time since Jake had met her, Emma Henley smiled with genuine warmth. "I think I'd like to get to know you better, Jake Morrison."
"Much better."
As the sun rose over the Circle H Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake Morrison realized that he'd ridden into Clearwater expecting to collect a simple debt but had instead found something infinitely more valuable. Emma Henley wasn't just a reward being offered to settle an account, she was a remarkable woman who had earned his respect and admiration through her own strength and character. The question now was whether that respect and admiration could grow into something deeper and more lasting. Jake suspected it could, given time and the right circumstances. And, for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to finding out. 3 weeks after the Rustler incident, the Circle H Ranch buzzed with activity that hadn't been seen in over 2 years. Jake had kept his word about investing in the operation, bringing in crews to repair fences, hiring additional hands to help Miguel with the cattle, and purchasing materials needed to restore the property's infrastructure. But, more importantly, he'd been spending time getting to know Emma Henley as a person rather than just a potential business partner. The morning sun found them working side by side in the ranch's account books, spread across the kitchen table that had become their unofficial office. Emma wore a simple green dress that brought out her eyes, while Jake had traded his travel clothes for the practical work attire of a working rancher. "The fence repairs cost more than we estimated," Emma noted, running her finger down a column of figures. "But the investment was necessary. We haven't lost a single animal since the new wire went up." Jake nodded, appreciating how quickly Emma grasped both the immediate costs and long-term benefits of their improvements. "What about the cattle purchases we discussed? Are you still comfortable with those numbers?" Emma consulted another ledger before answering. 50 head of young breeding stock should cost about $800, based on current market prices. Add another $300 for feed and veterinary care through winter, and we're looking at substantial cash outlay. But the potential return? If everything goes well, we could double our herd size within 2 years and triple our annual income. Emma's voice carried excitement as she described the ranch's potential. Of course, that assumes good weather, healthy cattle, and stable prices. Jake found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd watched Emma transform from a woman worn down by desperate circumstances into someone energized by genuine possibilities for the future. The change was remarkable and attractive. "There's something we need to discuss," Jake said, setting down his pencil. "The bank president wants to meet with us tomorrow about the equipment loan." Emma's expression grew serious. Father's been dreading that meeting. $1,200 is still far beyond our means. "It's not beyond mine," Jake replied quietly. "The question is whether you're comfortable with me taking responsibility for your family's debts." Emma studied his face carefully. "That would make you more than just an investor in our operation. You'd essentially be taking over all our financial obligations. Which brings us back to the question of marriage." Jake leaned back in his chair, meeting Emma's gaze directly. "I've been thinking about it constantly for 3 weeks. And what have you concluded?" Jake chose his words carefully. "I've concluded that I care about you and your father, and I want to help secure your future. I've also concluded that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Emma's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Because you care about me, or because it would be a practical arrangement?" "Both," Jake answered honestly. I won't lie and claim to be madly in love with you after 3 weeks, Emma. But I will say that I find myself thinking about you constantly, that I look forward to our conversations every day, and that I can easily imagine building a life with you. Emma stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun.
I've been thinking about it too, she said without turning around.
About marriage, about the future, about what I want from life.
What do you want? Emma was quiet for a long moment before responding.
I want to feel valued for who I am, not just for what I can contribute to someone else's success. I want to be a true partner in whatever life I choose, not just an accessory or a burden. She turned to face him. And I want to know that my husband chose me because he genuinely wanted me, not because circumstances forced his hand. Jake stood and moved closer to her, stopping just within arm's reach. Emma, when your father first offered your hand in marriage to settle his debt, I thought he was insulting both of us. But these past 3 weeks have shown me that he wasn't offering you as payment for anything. He was offering me the chance to win something infinitely more valuable than money. Which is a partnership with a woman who could make me a better man and build something meaningful together. Jake reached out and gently took her hand.
I'm asking you to marry me because I want you as my wife, not because I need a business arrangement.
Emma's eyes searched his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. You're certain this isn't just obligation or pity?
I'm certain.
Jake squeezed her hand gently. Emma, if your father had paid his debt in cash 3 weeks ago, I would have ridden away and probably never seen you again. But I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. Before Emma could respond, the kitchen door opened and Samuel entered, his expression troubled.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have visitors coming up the road. 3 men on horseback, and they don't look friendly.
Jake moved to the window and studied the approaching riders. 3 hard-looking men rode toward the house at a deliberate pace, their hands resting conspicuously near their weapons. Jake recognized the type immediately, hired guns, probably sent by someone who wanted to intimidate the Henley family.
Do you recognize them?
Jake asked Samuel.
The one in front is Wade Garrett, works for Harrison Wells over at the Double W Ranch. Samuel's voice carried concern.
Wells has been trying to buy up failed ranches in this area for bargain prices. And he probably thought the Circle H would be available cheap after we missed our loan payments, Emma added grimly. Our recovery must have disappointed him. Jake checked his pistol automatically, a habit developed through years of dealing with dangerous situations.
Let's see what they want, but stay alert. Men like that don't make social calls.
The 3 riders stopped in front of the house, and Wade Garrett dismounted while his companions remained in their saddles. Garrett was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating people through reputation and implied threat. Samuel Henley, Garrett called out as Jake, Emma, and Samuel appeared on the front porch.
Mr. Wells sent me to make you an offer.
What kind of offer? Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mr. Wells is prepared to pay fair market value for your ranch, assuming you're interested in selling.
Garrett's tone suggested that refusal might not be well received.
He knows you've had financial difficulties, and he's willing to help you out of a bad situation.
Jake stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Garrett and Emma. And what if they're not interested in selling?
Garrett's attention shifted to Jake, and his expression hardened as he recognized a potential obstacle to his employer's plans.
You must be the Morrison fellow we heard about. Word around town is that you've been investing money in this place.
Word around town is accurate, Jake replied evenly.
The Circle H isn't for sale.
Maybe that's not your decision to make, Garrett suggested, his hand moving closer to his gun. This is family business, and you're not family. Emma stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly.
Actually, Mr. Garrett, Jake is going to be family very soon. We're engaged to be married. The announcement surprised everyone, including Jake, though he was careful not to show it.
Emma had just publicly committed to their marriage without any formal proposal or discussion of terms.
Congratulations, Garrett said with obvious insincerity.
But engaged couples sometimes change their minds, and financial problems have a way of affecting relationships.
What's that supposed to mean? Samuel asked.
One of Garrett's companions, a stocky man with a scar across his left cheek, spoke for the first time. Means accidents happen, especially to folks who don't listen to reasonable offers. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake felt his muscles tense as he prepared for possible violence, but he kept his voice calm and controlled.
I think you gentlemen should leave now, Jake said quietly. Before someone says something they might regret.
Garrett studied Jake's face, clearly evaluating whether the newcomer represented a serious threat to their intimidation tactics. Whatever he saw there must have given him pause, because he stepped back toward his horse. We'll be around the area for a few days, Garrett announced as he remounted.
In case you folks change your minds about Mr. Wells' generous offer.
The three men rode away at the same deliberate pace they'd arrived, but Jake noticed they turned north rather than heading back toward the Double W Ranch. They were planning to stay close and watch for opportunities to cause trouble.
Well, Samuel said as the riders disappeared from view.
I guess word of our recovery has reached Harrison Wells.
Who is Wells exactly?
Jake asked, still watching the horizon where the three men had vanished. Big rancher who's been buying up struggling properties for the past 2 years, Emma explained. He pays cash but at prices well below market value, usually to families who are desperate to sell.
And families who refuse to sell sometimes have unfortunate accidents, Samuel added grimly.
Wells has never been directly connected to any violence, but several ranchers who turned down his offers have experienced mysterious problems.
Jake absorbed this information, recognizing that the Henley family now faced a new threat in addition to their ongoing financial challenges.
Men like Harrison Wells rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and the fact that he'd sent armed intimidators suggested he was serious about acquiring the Circle H ranch.
We need to be careful for the next few weeks, Jake said.
Men like Garrett don't give up easily, and Wells obviously wants this property badly enough to use pressure tactics. Emma moved closer to Jake, and he realized she was still processing her impulsive announcement about their engagement.
About what I said to Garrett, she began hesitantly.
You said we were engaged to be married, Jake replied with a slight smile.
Was that just to discourage him, or were you accepting my proposal?
Emma's cheeks colored again, but she met his eyes directly. I was accepting your proposal, assuming the offer was still open. It's open, Jake assured her, taking her hand again. Though I'd hoped for a more romantic setting than the front porch while armed men made threats.
Samuel clapped Jake on the shoulder. Welcome to the family, son. Though I have to say, your timing could have been better. When would you like to have the ceremony?
Jake asked Emma, suddenly, aware that they were discussing practical details of marriage while potentially dangerous men remained in the area. Soon, Emma replied without hesitation. If we're going to face whatever Wells has planned, we should do it as a legally married couple. The rest of the day was spent making practical preparations for both the wedding and the potential trouble that might follow. Jake sent Miguel into town to speak with Sheriff Bradley about the morning's visitors, while Emma and Samuel began planning a small ceremony that could take place within the week. That evening, as Jake and Emma sat on the front porch watching the sunset, they discussed the reality of their upcoming marriage and the challenges they would face together.
Are you certain about this? Emma asked quietly.
Once we're married, you'll be committed to whatever problems come with being part of this family. Jake took her hand and squeezed it gently.
Emma, I've been thinking about commitment and what it means.
When I rode into Clearwater 3 weeks ago, I was a bachelor with no obligations except to myself. Now I find myself looking forward to sharing both the burdens and the joys of building something with another person.
Even if that person comes with more problems than assets?
Especially then, Jake replied. Anyone can be a partner when times are good, Emma.
Real partnerships are tested when circumstances get difficult.
As darkness settled over the ranch, Jake realized that his life had changed in ways he never could have anticipated. He'd come to collect a debt and instead found himself preparing for marriage to a remarkable woman, rebuilding a ranch operation, and potentially facing conflict with a powerful neighbor who wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. But, instead of feeling overwhelmed by these unexpected complications, Jake felt energized by the challenges ahead. Emma Henley had brought purpose and meaning to his life that had been missing during his years of accumulating wealth for its own sake. Tomorrow would bring their meeting with the bank president, next week would bring their wedding, and, beyond that lay whatever tests Harrison Wells might devise. Yet Jake Morrison had never felt more confident about the future, because he would be facing it alongside a woman who had already proven she could handle whatever life might bring. The wedding of Jake Morrison and Emma Henley took place on a crisp Saturday morning in the small church at the heart of Clearwater, with most of the town in attendance despite the short notice. Emma wore her mother's ivory dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her slender frame, while Jake stood at the altar in his best suit, nervously adjusting his string tie as the simple ceremony began.
Sheriff Bradley served as Jake's best man, while Martha Stevens, the banker's wife and Emma's childhood friend, stood beside the bride as matron of honor.
Samuel Henley watched from the front pew with tears in his eyes, clearly moved by seeing his daughter married despite the unusual circumstances that had brought the couple together.
"Do you, Jacob Morrison, take Emma Henley to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Pastor Williams asked in his resonant voice that had united dozens of couples over his 20 years in Clearwater.
"I do," Jake replied firmly, looking into Emma's green eyes as he spoke the words that would bind them together legally and spiritually.
"And, do you, Emma Henley, take Jacob Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Emma's voice was clear and steady as she answered, "I do." The simple gold band that Jake slipped onto Emma's finger had belonged to his grandmother, the only piece of family jewelry he'd inherited from his parents' estate. Emma wore it with obvious pride as Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake's kiss was gentle but filled with promise for their future together. The reception at the church hall was modest but cheerful, with the ladies of Clearwater providing food and music for the celebration. Jake found himself repeatedly amazed by the warmth with which the community had embraced their hasty marriage, despite the gossip and speculation that had preceded it. "You got yourself a fine woman, Jake," Sheriff Bradley said as they stood near the refreshment table, watching Emma accept congratulations from a group of ranchers' wives. "Emma's got backbone and good sense, qualities that matter more than beauty in a marriage partner." "She's got beauty too," Jake replied, admiring the way Emma's face lit up as she laughed at something Martha Stevens had said. "I'm a fortunate man, Tom." "Just remember that marriage is work, especially when you're starting with practical arrangements instead of romance," Bradley advised seriously. "You'll need to put effort into building the personal connection that most couples start with." Jake nodded, appreciating the sheriff's honest counsel. He and Emma had married for logical reasons, but they would need to create the emotional foundation for their partnership through daily choices and shared experiences. The celebration was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Harrison Wells rode up to the church in an expensive buggy pulled by matched horses, his appearance drawing immediate attention from the wedding guests. Wells was a big man in his 50s, expensively dressed and radiating the confidence that came from wealth and power. "Mr. Morrison," Wells said as he approached the receiving line where Jake and Emma were greeting well-wishers. "Congratulations on your marriage. I hope you'll both be very happy." "Thank you," Jake replied cautiously, aware that every conversation in the hall had stopped as people strained to hear this unexpected encounter. Wells turned his attention to Emma, his smile polite but somehow predatory. "Mrs. Morrison, you look lovely. Your mother would have been proud to see you married in her dress." "You knew my mother?" Emma asked, surprised by the personal reference. "Mary and I were childhood friends before she married your father and moved to the Circle H," Wells replied smoothly. "She was a remarkable woman who deserved a better fate than dying young on a struggling ranch." The implied criticism of Samuel Henley was subtle but unmistakable, and Jake felt Emma stiffen beside him at the slight toward her father. "My mother lived exactly the life she chose," Emma replied with cool dignity. "She never expressed any regrets about marrying my father or living on our ranch." "Of course not," Wells agreed easily. "Mary always was loyal to her commitments, even when they weren't in her best interests." He paused meaningfully before continuing. "I hope her daughter has inherited that same loyalty." Jake stepped slightly forward, inserting himself more prominently into the conversation. Was there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mr. Wells? This is a wedding reception, not a business meeting. Wells's expression hardened almost imperceptibly at Jake's intervention. Actually, I came to extend an invitation. My wife is hosting a dinner party next Saturday evening for the prominent ranchers in the area. We'd be honored to have you and your bride attend.
The invitation was clearly a command rather than a request, designed to demonstrate Wells's social dominance and put the newly married couple in a subordinate position.
Jake understood the power play immediately. That's very kind, Emma replied before Jake could answer. But I'm afraid we'll be too busy settling into married life to attend social functions for several weeks. Wells's smile became more strained.
Of course, newlyweds need time to adjust to their new circumstances. Perhaps when you've had time to evaluate your situation more thoroughly, you'll find social connections in the community beneficial. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Wells was making it clear that he expected the Morrisons to acknowledge his social and economic leadership in the area, and that resistance would have consequences.
We appreciate the invitation, Jake said diplomatically. When we're ready to resume social activities, we'll certainly consider it.
Wells nodded curtly and prepared to leave, but paused for one final comment.
Marriage changes many things, Mr. Morrison.
Sometimes it clarifies what's truly important, and sometimes it complicates situations that were previously straightforward.
I trust you'll find it clarifying.
After Wells departed, the reception continued, but the mood had been subtly altered by his unexpected appearance. Several guests approached Jake and Emma to express support, making it clear that many in the community were uncomfortable with Wells's increasingly aggressive business tactics. Don't let Harrison Wells spoil your wedding day, Martha Stevens advised Emma as they stood near the punch bowl. He's been trying to intimidate folks around here for months, but most people see right through his act.
What happened to the families who sold out to him? Emma asked. Martha's expression darkened. The Petersons moved back east after their barn burned down mysteriously. The Martinez family lost most of their horses to some kind of poisoning that the veterinarian couldn't explain. And the Coopers decided to sell after their eldest son was badly beaten by unknown assailants in town one night. Emma absorbed this information grimly. So the families who refused to sell experience unfortunate accidents. Nothing that can be proven, but the pattern is clear enough.
Martha glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Wells wants to control all the best ranch land in the county, and he's not particular about his methods. The conversation was interrupted by Miguel Santos, who approached with obvious urgency.
Senor Jake, Senora Emma, forgive me for disturbing your celebration. But there is a problem at the ranch. What kind of problem? Jake asked immediately.
The new fence in the north pasture has been cut again, and someone drove off about 20 head of cattle during the night.
Miguel's voice carried anger as well as concern.
They also left a message. Miguel handed Jake a piece of paper that had been nailed to a fence post. The message was brief and signed, "Congratulations on your wedding.
Hope your marriage lasts longer than your cattle operation." Emma read the note over Jake's shoulder, her face paling slightly at the obvious threat. The timing was clearly intended to ruin their wedding day and demonstrate Wells's ability to strike whenever he chose. Did anyone see anything? Jake asked, crumpling the threatening note in his fist. No, senor.
They came and left in the darkness, very quiet and professional.
Miguel shook his head grimly.
But I found tracks leading toward the Brazos River country, same direction the rustlers went before. Jake looked at Emma, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. They both understood that this was Wells's response to their marriage and their refusal to accept his social dominance. The cattle theft was a warning that worse things would follow if they continued to resist his pressure. "We should go home," Emma said quietly.
"This is no longer just about our wedding day."
Jake nodded and began making their excuses to the wedding guests, explaining that ranch business required their immediate attention.
Most people understood, and several offered to help with whatever problems they were facing.
The ride back to the Circle H was somber, with Jake and Emma both lost in thought about the escalating conflict with Harrison Wells. Their wedding day had been beautiful but brief, overshadowed by the reality that they now faced a powerful enemy who was willing to use criminal tactics to achieve his goals. "I'm sorry our wedding was ruined," Jake said as they approached the ranch house in the late afternoon. "It wasn't ruined," Emma replied firmly. "We're married, which was the important part. Everything else is just complications that we'll deal with together." As they dismounted in front of their home, Jake realized that Emma was right about what mattered most. They were now legally and spiritually united, committed to facing whatever challenges lay ahead as a team rather than as individuals struggling alone. Samuel met them at the door with coffee and the grim satisfaction of a man who had been proven right about expecting trouble. "I heard what happened from Miguel. 20 head is a significant loss, but it could have been worse." "It's going to get worse," Jake said bluntly. "Wells is escalating his pressure, and cattle theft is just the beginning." Emma removed her wedding dress and changed into practical work clothes, the transformation symbolic of their rapid transition from newlyweds to ranchers under siege. When she rejoined Jake and Samuel in the kitchen, her expression was determined rather than defeated. "What do we do about this?" she asked, settling at the table where they had spent so many hours planning the ranch's recovery. Jake considered their options carefully. They could report the theft to Sheriff Bradley, but proving Wells's involvement would be nearly impossible. They could try to track the stolen cattle themselves, but that would be dangerous and might play into Wells's hands. Or they could take defensive measures and prepare for whatever Wells might try next. "We hire additional security," Jake decided. "Men who can watch our property and protect our interests when we can't be everywhere at once." "That costs money," Samuel pointed out. "We have money," Jake replied. "And we need to use it to protect our investment." Over the next several hours, they developed a comprehensive plan for defending the ranch against further attacks. Jake would hire guards to patrol the property at night, Miguel would organize a system of signals that could summon help quickly if problems arose, and they would coordinate with Sheriff Bradley to ensure law enforcement was aware of the threats they were facing. As evening settled over the Circle H ranch, Jake and Emma sat on the front porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. They had been married for less than 12 hours, but already they were planning strategies for protecting their life together from enemies who wanted to destroy everything they were building. "Do you regret marrying me?" Emma asked quietly, her head resting against Jake's shoulder as they sat together on the porch swing Samuel had built years earlier for quiet evenings. "Never," Jake replied without hesitation. "This is exactly where I want to be, with exactly the person I want to share my life with." Emma turned to look at his face in the fading light. "Even with all the complications and dangers?" Jake cupped her face gently in his hands, marveling at the trust he saw in her green eyes. "Especially with the complications and dangers. Emma, I've spent years building wealth and avoiding commitments because I thought independence was more valuable than partnership. You've shown me how wrong I was." Their first kiss as a married couple was tender and full of promise, a moment of perfect intimacy despite the challenges surrounding them. As they held each other on the porch of their home, Jake Morrison realized that coming to Clearwater to collect a debt had led him to find the greatest treasure of his life. Emma Henley Morrison was indeed a reward, but not the kind that could be bought, sold, or given away. She was a gift he had earned through proving himself worthy of her trust and partnership. And no amount of money or threats from powerful enemies could diminish the value of what they had found together. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as the newlyweds went inside their home, ready to begin building the life they would share regardless of whatever challenges tomorrow might bring.